Good day. Today is Tuesday, 9th December 2025, and let me first begin this program by asking you once again to tick the like button if once you have watched this video or whichever part of this video you want to watch, you've liked what you've heard, and you want to indicate this fact. Now, the big news over the last 24 hours, in the conflict in Ukraine at least, which, to repeat, remains for me by far the most important event that is taking place in the world at the present time. Anyway, the big news is the continued advance of the Russian army on the battlefronts. Now, that ought to be an obvious statement of fact, but if you go to the media in the West, you will find that it is not so at all. They are all discussing the meeting that took place in London, the one which was attended by President Zelensky, the meeting at which Donald Trump's suggestions to move forward with substantive peace negotiations with the Russians were in effect summarily rejected by the Europeans and by the Ukrainians. And of course, there's also further reports about the fact that President Zelensky moved on after the meeting, apparently to Brussels. I'm not quite sure what he was doing there. He doesn't seem to have stayed there very long because he is currently in Rome, where he is meeting the Pope, and he's also, before long, apparently going to have another meeting with Giorgia Meloni, who is the Prime Minister of Italy and who has been a stalwart friend of his, but whose position, as I understand it, in Italy is now beginning to look more shaky than it did a few months ago. So Zelensky, as always, is on his travels. The situation in Ukraine may go from bad to worse, but he, of course, continues on his European tours. He meets his friends. He's met them in London, perhaps in Brussels, definitely in Rome. And I'm going to say something. I can understand why the Pope wants to meet Zelensky, but from what I can tell, the Pope, in meeting Zelensky, is giving some indications of sympathy and support for him and for Ukraine. And I would say that, in my opinion, that is unwise. The Pope is both a religious leader, of course. He is also, at least to some extent, a political leader. He remains the head of state of the Vatican City State, and the Curia, the Roman government, the Vatican government, still has its own very extensive foreign ministry, and it even, I understand, has an intelligence agencies of a kind. So, well, you can understand why the leader of a sovereign country might want to meet with the leader of another sovereign country. But the Pope is also the leader of the Catholic Church, the world's biggest Christian church, and I think that it might not be wise for him to involve himself too closely with someone like Zelensky, who, let us remember, presides over a government that has been taking legal action, and not just legal action, but forcible action against the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which has taken steps to take control of churches, and which has been promoting a rival church to what was, until a short time ago, a few years ago, the official canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and which, as far as I am concerned, as an Orthodox Christian, remains the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Anyway, that's the Pope. I ought to say that in Britain, the royal family there has also been taking steps to give their indications of their support for Zelensky and for Ukraine over the course of a previous trip. to Britain that took place, by my recollection, just 2 weeks ago. Zelensky was received by the king in Windsor Castle, and the king seemed to be going out of his way to make clear his support of Zelensky. And the Queen has just made statements to, I believe, a business forum in which she has also apparently given further verbal support to Zelensky and to Ukraine. And from the rather garbled mentions of this speech, which I have seen, has repeated the tired parallels so loved by some people in Britain between the conflict in Ukraine and the Second World War, parallels which, as far as I'm concerned, at least the way they're played out in Britain, are profoundly and completely wrong. I think all of this is most unwise. I don't think the Pope will gain anything good from meeting Zelensky in the way that he has done. I think in time he will be deeply embarrassed by the fact that he's having these meetings with him. And, well, as for the British royal family, I think their embarrassment is going to be much greater. But anyway, since I've started with London, about the meeting in London, I suppose I must continue. And it was entirely predictable. Zelensky came to the meeting. The European leaders met him there. They all apparently agreed that the plan that Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been working on is unacceptable. They all, exactly as Bloomberg said they would, and I discussed this in a program recently, they all apparently urged Zelensky to stand firm on the territorial issue, to categorically refuse to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Donbass. Zelensky was delighted to agree. He's now made statements that he is not prepared to withdraw any Ukrainian troops from any position anywhere on the contact line at all. He's made further statements, by the way, saying that the Ukrainians, all the Ukrainians are asking what happens after there is a peace and how Ukraine is to be protected from any future Russian attack. He's clearly angling for security guarantees from the United States that would extend American protection to Ukraine, just saying. And of course, he's doing this again at the urging of the Europeans who have been pushing the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine ever since the Anchorage summit between Putin and Trump, and who have been talking incessantly and continuously about this topic and the kind of security guarantees that they're thinking about, quite obviously and clearly are intended to provide a pathway for Ukraine eventually to enter NATO. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, Keir Starmer, who, remember, is a trained lawyer and who, as a lawyer, presumably understands the importance of words. Anyway, he made clear what the European intention continues to be. Instead of talking about a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which, by the way, can itself be interpreted in all sorts of ways which the Russians might not appreciate. Anyway, he spoke instead about a just and lasting ceasefire. In other words, not a peace at all, not a peace agreement with Russia at all, a situation where the matter is dealt with on a temporary basis. Something might be lasting, but that is not the same as permanent. And of course, it's not difficult to work out that what Starmer is talking about is a freeze of the conflict, a return to the Kellogg Plan, a situation where the fighting, as Zelensky says, stops on the existing conflict lines, with the Ukrainians still in Donbass, still in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, still in positions on the east bank in eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, and where Russian control of territories in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass and Zaporozhye is not recognized, and where the Ukrainians ultimately expect, as a result of some long-term process, perhaps not so long-term, to regain possession of all of these territories, with the Russians pushed towards a humiliating peace, in which, of course, they pay Ukraine reparation loans and agree to their commanders and perhaps political leaders being placed on trial in war crimes tribunals and all of those things. Anyway, now Zelensky also said that there is a counter-proposal to the American proposal. He said that it is a 20-point proposal. All of the difficult sections of the American proposal have apparently been deleted from it. Obviously, the text of this counter-proposal has not been produced and not seen, but I am guessing that the references to Ukraine not joining NATO, to it coming again a neutral, non-aligned country, to the other NATO countries accepting that, all of those references have been removed, as, of course, have any references to the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass. I suspect that the document also includes, or rather has deleted, the references to caps on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. An American draft allowed Ukraine to have a military of 600,000 men. The Europeans then increased that to 800,000 men, all ridiculous figures. But my own guess is that that provision has now been deleted completely from this 20-point document. So what we have here, in effect, is the Kellogg Plan all over again. The freeze of the conflict with the coalition of the willing having resurrected itself, with talk again about deploying European troops in Western Ukraine, still there in the background and suggested by the Europeans and insisted upon by the Europeans, though perhaps not so openly discussed in this meeting in London. And, well, the Europeans have also been making various comments. Macron has been talking about how, contrary to what Donald Trump says, the Ukrainians allegedly have lots of cards to play. He was talking to some extent, it seems to me, about the frozen Russian assets, that the Ukrainians should be given those, that the Europeans should confiscate them. At various times, by the way, Macron has appeared to resist that proposal. He has, in the past, spoken about the fact that sovereign assets are sacrosanct and protected under international law. But Macron changes his stance regularly, and my guess is that he has changed his stance on this point as well. Macron, incidentally, has been taking an extremely aggressive and hard line about Russia, and this has been communicated to his top military people. And the chief of staff of the French army caused considerable upset recently in a meeting of French local government officials who come from various parties, when the Chief of Staff said that before long France could find itself in a war with Russia, which, by the way, let us never forget is a nuclear power, in fact the world's biggest nuclear power, and that the French must be prepared for the fact that they will have to sacrifice the lives of some of their children. That did not go down well at all, and provoked quite a lot of criticism. But Macron himself doesn't seem to be in any way fazed by that. He continues this belligerent rhetoric and language against Russia, deeply unpopular though it is in France and with the French people. But anyway, so we've had all of that. Merz, by the way, has now returned to Germany, and he's been in Rhineland-Pfalz, and he's made speeches there, and he's made it very clear that he does not agree with many parts of the new security policy document that has just been published by the United States, the National Security Strategy document. He said that there are sections of it that he does not agree with it. And of course, I would not be complete in discussing the various things that European leaders have been saying if I didn't mention Kallis. She's going around warning everybody that people must be very careful not to fall into Russian traps, and that the Russians are not interested in peace and never have been, apparently. And, well, if you listen to Kallis, what one senses is that for her, Russia is irredeemably belligerent and aggressive. It has always been so, continues to be so, and will always be so. That it is in effect in a state of almost continuous war with the West, and that it will remain that way forever until Russia is itself destroyed. She has spoken in the past about breaking up Russia into its component parts. She's actually advocated this. And I've never seen a genuine peace proposal of any kind that she has shown any interest in. Now, this extreme hostility to Russia by Kallis, which frankly has, I would say, almost a pathological quality, has made her persona non grata practically across all of the world outside Europe. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is himself someone, remember, with a neocon background, apparently no longer wants to meet with her. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi doesn't want to meet with her. In India, she's not welcome either, apparently. Given that that is so, it is truly extraordinary. It is generally remarkable that she continues to be the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy. The idea that such a person who is entirely rejected by the entire global community outside Europe, all the great powers outside Europe, the United States, Russia, obviously, who she doesn't want to talk to anyway, China, India, much of the global south as far as I can tell. The fact that they don't want to talk with her or have anything to do with her ought in any rational world to mean that the European leaders, many of whom basically, one senses, are also deeply frustrated with her, they ought to be giving her marching orders. There was a recent article in the Daily Telegraph by the British journalist Owen Matthews, who has become increasingly critical, I should say, of European and British and Western policy in the conflict in Ukraine, notwithstanding that he remains a staunch supporter of Ukraine. Anyway, he has described Kallis as the gift to Putin that goes on giving. Her extreme hostility to Russia consistently works to Russian advantage. Now, this is so obvious. It is so obvious to anybody, I would have thought, who has any objective understanding of the situation. As I think I mentioned in a recent programme, when she turned up at a recent meeting of the European Parliament to address the MPs there, who, again, a highly Russophobic group, just to say. Anyway, even they found her, the way that she spoke, went altogether too far. And apparently they did not like the flippancy in which she dismissed suggestions about potential court cases against Euroclear and against European states connected with any misappropriation or seizure of Russian assets. So logically, what ought to be happening is that Macron, Meloni, Ursula herself ought to be telling Kallis, Kaya, it's time for you to go. You can't continue as the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy any further. And it tells you all you need to know about the state of Europe today, that as far as I'm aware, none of them have said this. She still gets invited to all the meetings. She still participates in all of the decisions. She still runs the department, which is now, of course, itself under investigation on corruption issues. Anyway, she is still there, and there is no sign that any one of them want to let her go. And, well, if any one of these European leaders brought up with Zelensky the ongoing corruption investigations in Kiev, what has happened to Yermak, what has happened to Mijnich, the Zelensky associate who's now escaped to Israel, the fact that apparently more investigations are underway, the concerns about the corruption. Well, I saw no sign of this, none at all. And according to The Guardian, they not only agreed with Zelensky, I don't think they had much persuading to do, that in effect all of the important provisions of the Witkoff-Kushner 28 points should be deleted and that Ukraine should refuse to work with them. But according to The Guardian, they're all very pleased with each other because they believe, they hope that they have made ground, that they made progress in whatever plan it is they now have to seize and confiscate and misappropriate the Russian assets. And by the way, on that topic, Ursula has been circulating around Europe a truly extraordinary, a genuinely fantastic document which shows how much liability all of the member states of the European Union would take on in terms of providing a guarantee or backstop for the 140 billion euro loan, which, to repeat again, it seems to me the plan is that it will still be secured against the Russian assets. Each state is supposed, however, to agree that if everything fails, if the Ukrainians don't pay the loan, and who expects that the Ukrainians will ever repay any loan? My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, who follows this whole business closely, pointed out that about 2 years ago, back in 2023, the Ukrainians were given a $50 billion loan. $50 billion. What became of that? What happened to all that money? Who is accounting for it? Then there was another 40 billion euro loan that the European Union came up with. And apparently part of the 140 billion euro loan is intended, it seems, to repay that loan. So the Europeans are going to lend money to the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians can repay money that the Europeans previously loaned to them, secured on the money of Russia, which of course doesn't belong to them. I mean, to me, this is getting crazier and crazier. We are absolutely in Alice in Wonderland thinking. But as for this, as I said, truly bizarre document, as I said, saying that Germany should be on the hook for 50 billion euros and other countries should be on the hook for this amount of euros and those number of billions of euros. This document that Ursula is providing, well, a number of immediate observations about this. Upon what basis does Ursula decide the guarantees, the size of the guarantees that European states are going to give? Surely that is their business, and it's not even for her to propose this. Secondly, I noticed that Hungary and Slovakia are amongst the countries that are going to be guaranteeing part of this loan. So Hungary's guarantee is 2 billion euros, 2 billion, which is a lot of money for a relatively small country. Now, has Hungary agreed to this? Has Slovakia agreed to this? Have all of these other countries agreed to any of this? Well, of course they haven't. And we come back to that crazy proposal, the proposal that the European Commission, that one of the European officials told the Financial Times was crazy, which is that you do this by invoking emergency powers, that there is a financial crisis in Europe if the Russian money, the Russian assets leave Europe, so you prevent Russian assets from ever being paid back to Russia by invoking EU emergency powers. And you also use emergency powers to override the vetoes on things like this of countries like Hungary and Slovakia and all of the others. Now, here I'm going to say this. I believe, in fact, I am absolutely sure that using emergency powers to float any kind of loan and to prevent a situation where sanctions are lifted and money is repaid to Russia, which belongs to Russia. Any situation where emergency powers are used to do that kind of thing, that seems to me to be utterly and completely wrong. But I'm going to say something else. Using emergency powers to impose on member states liabilities on this kind of scale, which they have not agreed to in connection with policies that they absolutely reject. I have no doubt whatsoever that this is illegal under the treaties. In fact, it is so illegal that I wonder whether even the European Court of Justice, which bends over backwards to legalise anything and everything that the European Commission does. Anyway, I wonder whether they can swallow this one. Perhaps they can, and perhaps they will. But if they do, by the way, the precedent established would be extraordinary, because it would mean that the European Commission, using emergency powers, can impose financial liabilities on member states and extract money from them in a way that is only a step away from establishing a direct system of taxation. I mean, something of this kind would rewrite the treaties so comprehensively and would empower the Commission to such a degree that we would be perfectly justified in that case in saying that this step, if it is ever made, would indeed convert the Commission from an institution of the European Union into something closer to a European government. And by the way, a European government which is not directly elected by the people of Europe, even though I accept and acknowledge that it is supposed to be legit. It is supposed to be subject to the European Parliament, and commissioners are supposed to pass through a confirmation process by the European Parliament. But everybody who's followed the European system, European politics, knows, and I've discussed this with members of the European Parliament, everybody knows that this is a pure formality. Anyway, there it is. So this is what the leaders of Europe are doing. Now, Donald Trump has commented about this, and he's commented about it in his usual way. He has published or republished on Truth Social an article from the New York Post, a New York-based newspaper, which, by the way, was founded by none other than Alexander Hamilton, just saying. But anyway, this newspaper, the New York Post, is deeply supportive of Trump. It's one of the very, very few newspapers in the United States which is. But anyway, the title of the article is "You Impotent Europeans Can Only Fume as Trump Rightly Sidelines Them from Ukraine Deal." And the implication is that Trump has watched all that has happened in London, all that's going on in Brussels, all the things that Friedrich Merz has been saying in Rhineland-Pfalz, all the things that Macron has been saying and Starmer has been saying, and that he is quietly furious, and that this has hardened his intention to cut the Europeans completely out of the negotiating process to the extent that he can. And to repeat a point that I made about the meeting which took place last week in Moscow between Witkoff and Kushner and President Putin of Russia. There'd already been a meeting in Geneva between the Americans and the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and the Europeans came away believing that they'd whittled down the 28 points that Kushner and Witkoff had come up with, that they'd whittled them down to 19 points. But later, in the subsequent meeting between Putin and Witkoff and Kushner, it was clear that the Americans were not taking the 19-point document seriously. They were continuing to discuss and work with Putin on the original 28 points. So Trump, I don't think, is going to take this 20-point proposal that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are going to come up, are bringing to him at all seriously. But then, to say it frankly, I don't think he can move forward with his 28 points either. And to repeat again about the 28 points, it's important to stress that the Russians continue to say that parts of the 28 points are unacceptable to them, that this is not a draft agreement, that they have certainly not agreed to any part of this 28 points, that they accept. Putin has said it, Usurps has said it, Lavrov has said it, that they accept and appreciate that this is a work in progress, that these are discussion points put forward by the Americans, that they appear to move closer to Russian positions. So the Russians have said all of that, but they've made it very clear that the 28 points, as they stand, are not an agreement. But nonetheless, they're still, for the Americans, the point of departure in discussions with the Russians, and the Russians have confirmed that they are prepared to treat them as such. So the Americans paid no heed to the previous 19-point document, and they're not going to pay any attention to this 20-point document that the Europeans are coming up with. But the Americans, I doubt, are going to be able to move forward with the 28 points either. Because as I've discussed, both on this channel and in other programs, yes, Donald Trump might want to end the Ukraine war. He might be keen to come to some long-term understanding with the Russians. He might be in a position to brush the Ukrainians aside, and he might be able to brush the Europeans aside and to marginalize them. He might be willing to enter into direct bilateral negotiations with the Russians. After all, that was what he did in Anchorage, and ultimately that is what Witkoff and Kushner were doing when they met with Putin in Moscow. But he cannot bring the entire American political class with him. The American political class are allied to Zelensky and to the Europeans. They share their perspectives. They also share their perspectives in rejecting the national security document, the national security strategy paper just published by the American government. They remain committed Atlanticists, and they're not prepared to give any ground on this at all. And we've just had a demonstration of this by Congress. Congress has voted, I believe it's both houses of Congress, have voted to allocate $800 million out of the defense budget, the US defense budget, to Ukraine. This is over 2 years. In the measure of things, this is not a vast amount of money, not by the standards of what Ukraine is spending or what the United States spends on its defense budget in any 1 year. But it flies completely in the face of Donald Trump's repeated insistence that the United States is no longer writing any more checks for Ukraine, is no longer giving money to Ukraine. Congress, the reason they've passed this resolution is because they're making it absolutely clear that they don't agree, that they support Ukraine in exactly the same way that they have always done. There remains a large neocon majority in the Senate, a neocon majority in the House, perhaps a little less big, but nonetheless big enough, and of course the bureaucracy, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the staff of the National Security Council, all of them share these views. So, to repeat again, we've had an enormous effort by the President and by his team to move the dial. They went along with Kellogg for the first few months, then sometime in July, August, they came round to moving closer to the Russian positions, to Istanbul Plus. Trump appeared to agree with that when he met with Putin in Anchorage. We've had further diplomatic moves by Witkoff and Kushner, who, in Kushner's case, he's not a member of the US government at all, and it's important to remember that. And Witkoff's exact role in the American government, all of that continues to remain obscure. But there's no sign of a proper US negotiating team being put together, because the bureaucracy will not provide such a negotiating team. And if it does, its purpose will not be to advance the negotiations, but to sabotage them, just say. And, well, Congress, the entire political system in the United States remains fundamentally opposed to whatever it is that Trump, in his overcomplicated and inconsistent way, is trying to do. And though I think that amongst the wider American public, if this policy was simply and straightforwardly explained to them that the United States must stop this overcommitment to Ukraine, I think there would be considerable support. The fact is that the president has never provided an explanation of his policy in that simple and straightforward way. Perhaps he can't, because perhaps he doesn't understand it fully himself. But anyway, beyond that, in a political system like the American, ultimately, on foreign policy issues, it is what the political class, the bureaucracy in Washington think. The president might have different ideas, but it doesn't follow that he can actually implement them. So, there's been this point, the discussion points made about continuities of agenda. They do exist. Trump might not share the feelings, the sense of commitment to the continuity of agenda. Indeed, he might have been elected in 2015, in 2016, and again in 2024 to break with that continuity of agenda. But he doesn't have the political authority and the political strength to be able to do it. I doubt that there is any individual, any single president who would be able to do so. And that is the reality that we see in the United States today. So I've gone through a long discussion of all of this. I don't like doing it because, again, we're moving in circles. But to repeat again, it is the military situation that is going to determine the outcome. Professor Mearsheimer, John Mearsheimer, is absolutely correct about this. Given that the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the powers that be in Washington oppose any move towards a serious negotiated peace, a serious negotiated peace is not going to happen. How can it? It is impossible. It won't take place. And the Russians are fine with it. To repeat again, Putin, at a recent meeting in the Security Council, actually said as much. He said, well, I've read the 28 points. This is a good document. I can work with it. I don't agree with large parts of it, but we can certainly make progress on it. We've always been ready to sit down and talk, and if we can achieve a peaceful resolution of the conflict, we will do so. After all, we are civilized people, and besides, it's what our allies, China, Brazil, India, all of them, want us to do. But if we have to achieve our objectives through war, well, we are prepared to do that as well. And in fact, we would prefer, if anything, to achieve it in that way. Presumably because, despite the cost in human lives, that would be a more permanent, a more stable, a more clear-cut outcome. So the Russians, of course, they will negotiate. They will meet with Witkoff and Kushner. They will entertain Trump's plans. If Trump wants to talk to Putin to discuss all of this, they will pick up the Putin will pick up the phone and will speak to Trump about it. But the Russians themselves, I suspect, have no real belief in any of this. They've repeatedly pointed out that they've had a whole succession of different meetings with the Ukrainians in Istanbul. The Ukrainians have not come back and responded to the Russian proposals to upgrade the status of the chief negotiators. I've made this point before. The Europeans and the Ukrainians complained that Vladimir Medinsky, a very senior aide of Putin's, was too low-ranking a figure to lead the Russian negotiating team. Putin is now proposing to upgrade the negotiating teams to have a more senior person replace Medinsky, and wanting the Ukrainians to do the same, though that, of course, is up to them. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians, who previously criticized the appointment of Medinsky and who ridiculed and mocked him, now that Putin is actually offering to appoint somebody more senior to supersede him, well, they're now showing absolutely no interest in that. They have not responded to that proposal, just as they have not responded to the Russian proposals to to set up 3 working parties to discuss the details of the conflict. So there it is. I've spent a lot of time, again, discussing these negotiations. I feel I have to, but I don't have any expectation that they will lead anywhere. But what these discussions do achieve, in my opinion, is that they highlight again the utter moral, intellectual, political bankruptcy of the leaders of Europe. Their inability to negotiate themselves out of a situation where they are going to lose. They remain obsessed with this conflict, obsessed with Russia, and they are taking down Europe and perhaps in time the entire Western alliance with them. But they talk all the time to each other. They treat Kallis as a responsible foreign minister whose words should be judged and listened to and respected. and they become infected with her fanaticism, and they are leading Europe over the cliff. The Americans, as again the national security strategy document showed, are baffled and astonished by it. The Chinese, the Indians, the global south are all astonished and baffled by it. But that is what they insist that they're going to do. And I will just finish by making one final point. I was told by a very interesting source that I have, a person who corresponds with me frequently and who is very, very well informed about discussions that take place in Moscow, that one of the things that the Europeans don't understand is that the Russians actually would be happy if the Europeans did seize these assets. The Russians know that they will never see these assets again. And besides, their financial position has actually consolidated and grown stronger since those assets were frozen. This is a complex point which I'm not going to discuss in more depth in this program, but they don't need this money. The Europeans doing this illegal thing, by contrast, puts the Russians in a strong position. They can bring court cases. I've already explained that under the commercial treaty between Belgium and Russia, the Russians can appoint an international arbitration court, which under international law has binding effect on Belgium. Just to say, all of the discussions that have taken place in Europe have in effect made the case the Russians will make at this court for them. All they need to do is to reproduce all of the statements made by Euroclear, by the Belgians, by other European officials. They can even produce the articles that have appeared in the Financial Times, talking about, with European officials, talking about crazy ideas, and the European Union exhausting legal tricks. They can bring all of this up, and they will be confident that they will win the case. And they will also be sure that even if there is no immediate explosion, no vast outflow of money from Europe, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Chinese, perhaps they won't take out all of their money from Europe at once. Gradually they will do so. And China has now set up its own depository. Russia has set up its own depository. Money can start to flow from the global markets into these depositories. And BRICS will strengthen. And the key thing that Putin discussed with Modi over the course of his trip to India, as we now know, was strengthening BRICS. So, the Russians, far from being upset and horrified about the Europeans seizing this money, probably, in fact, I've been told that they would be actually happy if that happened. And the Russians also know something else, which is a point also made by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, that anybody who believes that Ukraine is going to have all its costs covered for 2 years if this 140 billion euro loan is ever made is living in fantasy land. The money will have all gone within perhaps 6 months, a year at most. They're almost certainly not as long as that. And, well, at that point, what is it exactly that the Europeans do? Anyway, that's the situation in the diplomacy. Let me discuss now the real things that are actually happening. Let me turn to the military situation. And yesterday, the Ukrainian authorities, Deep State, for example, the Ukrainian mapping project, but other Ukrainian commentators, finally admitted that Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd are either encircled or are on the brink of being encircled. And they also acknowledged that the Russians have gained control of the southern part of the original Pokrovsk-Mirnograd cauldron. They've discussed how the Ukrainian troops who had positions there have retreated from those positions to more advantageous positions further north. This is all fantasy and fiction. In reality, all of these places were captured by the Russians from recollection about 3 weeks ago. But the Ukrainians have finally acknowledged this. And, well, all the indications are now that the Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk, Mirnograd cauldron are now basically bottled up into a small territory in Pokrovsk. Now, in Mirnograd, in northern Mirnograd, with Pokrovsk firmly under Russian control. Now, the Russian chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, who also happens to be the overall Russian military commander of the forces undertaking the special military operation. He has now visited the area of Pokrovsk. I think that, unlike Putin, I'm not convinced that these meetings that Putin is supposed to have attended at the headquarters either of the Army Group Center or of, I think it was Army Group West before, really did take place close to Pokrovsk and Kupiansk or any of these places. I actually believe that these conferences of which we've had film probably were staged in Moscow itself, just saying. But not that that makes any difference to the substance of what was said. But I think Gerasimov actually went to the real headquarters of Army Group Center and he met the commanders there and he discussed with the commanders the actual situation on the front lines. And we've had a report about this from the Russian Defense Ministry, Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, First Deputy Defense Minister, Army General Valery Gerasimov, inspected the fulfillment of combat objectives by units and formations of Combined Arms Army of Battle Group Center operating in the Dnipropetrovsk direction in the zone of the special military operation. During his work at the forward command post of the Combined Arms Army, General Gerasimov noted that after the city of Pokrovsk was liberated by units and formations of the Second Army, the main objective of Battle Group Center is to eliminate Ukrainian armed formations surrounded in Mirnograd. The Chief of the General Staff listened to reports by commanders of the 2nd and 51st Armies, commanders of military formations, and other military officials on the fulfillment of combat objectives. During the trip, the Russian military chief handed out state awards to servicemen who had distinguished themselves and also thanked them for their valor and courage displayed in accomplishing combat operations. And we then told that Gerasimov stressed that the liberation of Pokrovsk marks a major stage in liberating the entire territory of Donbass, and Russian troops acted skillfully and courageously. And then we have a direct quote. The siege of Pokrovsk, I should say that, of course, Gerasimov doesn't call it Pokrovsk, he calls it Krasnoarmeysk. I call it Pokrovsk to avoid confusion. But to repeat again, as far as Gerasimov is concerned, it is Krasnoarmeysk. The siege of Pokrovsk was a major stage in liberating the entire Donbass. In the course of liberating the city, military units and formations displayed initiative, acted skillfully, and chose those tactics of their operations that proved to be unknown to the enemy and came as a surprise to it. And then we're told that in Pokrovsk, this is again a quote from Gerasimov, our troops are checking residential areas and are assisting the local population. Over 200 people have been evacuated. Our troops have also liberated the communities of Rivne, Rog and Gnatovka, adjacent to Pokrovsk on the eastern side. I've discussed this in previous programs. And we're then told that during a report to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, that's Putin, on December 1st, on the liberation of Pokrovsk, the Supreme Commander drew attention and set the task of routing enemy forces in the area of Pokrovsk and in Dimitrov. As of today, units and formations of the Second Army have liberated the settlements of Rivne, Rog and Gnatovka adjacent to Pokrovsk from the eastern side, and have liberated the southern part of Mirnograd, which is more than 30% of the town. The 5th separate motorized rifle brigade of the 51st Army is destroying Ukrainian units blocked in Mirnograd. As of today, the southern city, the southern part of the town, has been liberated and is under our complete control. This accounts for more than 30% of the buildings in the city. Troops of the joint group of forces, that is to say of all of the Russian armed forces, continue their advance practically in all directions. So that was Gerasimov. And as I said, the Ukrainians themselves have finally acknowledged, reluctantly acknowledged, that the situation in Mirnograd is disintegrating, and have come close finally to admitting that Pokrovsk itself has been lost. So the battle continues. But in Mirnograd, at least, my sense is that we're coming towards its end. I watched an absolutely harrowing video which showed a group of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing from one building in Mirnograd. There was about a dozen of them. Again, I couldn't count them, but we were talking about perhaps a dozen, maybe 20 men altogether. And they fled from one building to another building. And of course, the Russian drone was observing the entire operation. And the moment they escaped to another building in Mirnograd, a Russian bomb, a fab bomb, fell on the building that they had fled to. And, well, I can't imagine that any of the soldiers inside it survived. I mean, it was a deeply upsetting video, and it was published just over the last 24 hours, as far as I know. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. There's also been very important news from Siversk. There's been video footage from Siversk, which appears to show Russian soldiers in the center of Siversk. And there's been admissions from Ukrainian commentators that the situation in Siversk now is very bad. And, well, I will set out my own personal view. I believe that the Russians now control at least 80% of Siversk, all of Siversk to be precise, east of the Bakhmutka River. I think that the Ukrainian forces in Siversk are now isolated in a small area to the west, on the west bank of the Bakhmutka River. They will not be able to stay there for very long. The Russians are already located in positions behind them. The Russians control villages like Dronivka, Platonovka, and Yampol. There is, in effect, an encirclement, a cauldron around Siversk. It will be impossible for the Ukrainians to hold their positions in western Siversk, west of the Bakhmutka River, for very long. The Russians don't need to cross the Bakhmutka River to reach western Siversk, the 20% of Siversk, which is still under Ukrainian control, because they are already in positions well to the west of the Bakhmutka River in this precise area. My own view, for what it's worth, is that Siversk is about to fall. It may happen today or tomorrow, or it may still take a few days. I am going to make a guess. I think that the Ukrainian garrison of Siversk is going to flee, and is going to flee southwest towards the important village Rai Alexandrovka, which continues to be under Ukrainian control. And they will have to cross the fields. And, well, I was driving around the English countryside north of London, and I saw many of the fields there now practically turned to marsh because of the incessant rain. I understand that the rain in Donbass has been every bit as bad. And of course, the ground in Donbass is even more prone to mud, to becoming mud, than the ground in England is. So they would have to flee across muddy fields, parts of them practically marsh, just to say. And I mean, that would be a dreadful thing. But anyway, presumably, or apparently, that is what they're now going to try, or will try to do. So anyway, that's the situation in Siversk. I suspect Siversk is about to fall, and the garrison is going to flee, and they'll be hunted by the Russians across the muddy fields, and I wonder how many of them will get to Rai Alexandrovka, or what condition they will be in when they eventually get there. Now, Gerasimov said that the Russians are advancing everywhere else. They're also advancing in Kharkiv region. I haven't discussed this much, but they've recently been closing off all the roadways there and destroying dams. There continues to be a narrative about a Ukrainian counterattack in Kupiansk, and about parts of Kupiansk having been recaptured by the Ukrainians. I've heard, as I said, these stories about successful Ukrainian counterattacks many times in Kotlino, in Toretsk, in all sorts of places. I have already made my own deep, profound skepticism about all of this well known. The Russian Defense Ministry says that units of West Group of forces continue to destroy enemy groups surrounded on the left bank of the Oskol River. So that doesn't suggest that the situation in Kupiansk has become difficult for the Russians. And the Ukrainians are still, in other words, in their cauldron. And a Russian official, to be precise, the Russian official who is in charge of administering Kupiansk, he said that the Ukrainians, his name, by the way, is Vitaly Ganchev. He said the Ukrainians are transferring forces to Kupiansk, but they full well know that they have lost the city and the entire agglomeration of the Kupiansk district. Our guys control all the main routes. And he went on to say that the situation for the Ukrainians continues to be very bad. So Ganchev basically is contradicting all the claims that you're seeing all over the internet, or at least over some parts of the internet, not all of it, not by any means all of it, that there is a Ukrainian counterattack, or at least a successful Ukrainian counterattack in Kupiansk. On the contrary, the way Ganchev describes it, and I think, by the way, that this is also consistent with the drone footage that I have seen, is that yes, there have been some Ukrainian attacks, but that they have been unsuccessful, and that when Ukrainian troops have tried to break through, the Russians have successfully hunted and destroyed them. Anyway, my own view about the stories about the successful Kupiansk offensive by the Ukrainians is that, again, it is intended to improve Zelensky's position in the discussions that he's having with the Europeans. It was intended to make his position in London better. And, well, I've discussed in many, many programs the cynicism and heartlessness behind that, but the Ukrainians have acted like that throughout the war. That is the way the Zelensky government has conducted the war, and that is how they continue to conduct it. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish the program today. Lots of things are taking place around the world. In Gaza, the situation remains complicated. There's been a renewal of the fighting between Cambodia and Thailand. This is one of the peace that President Trump claimed that he'd successfully mediated. It doesn't seem as if that lasted very long. There's problems in Sudan. There's problems in many places. And hopefully I'll be able to return to all of those in future programs. But this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our new Substack site. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.